Hello, I'm very happy to participate in this conference and to present you my paper, Words and Expressions of Métis Girls from Indochina Displaced in France, 1945-1970. From the Indochina War, 1946-1954, to the 1970, approximately 5,000 Métis children and youths, 3,000 boys and 2,000 girls were repatriated from Indochina with the objective to educating them and turning them into bridges between France and their country. Then, as decolonisation became effective, the objective became assimilation. These children are sheltered in specially organized homes or scattered in a multitude of religious institutions and do not have the right to speak their mother tongue. They are more object of a singular migration and postcolonial biopolitics than subjects who are actors in their own personal stories. Despite the very tight restriction imposed on them, the word of the Federation of Charity for French Children in Indochina, FOEFI, the main organization responsible for their care, express themselves through words and deeds. Thus, boys' foster homes are the scene of rebellions. Among nuns, girls are demanding better treatment, etc. As adults, the people concerned activated a delayed speech about their childhood experiences. Today, I will focus on the girls' experiences. Based on their testimony, I have studied what words they put on their experiences as children, and I have confronted them with the words of the institution that took them in. So, this communication questions the subjective construction of Eurasian girls and the drivers of emancipation through speech and action. How have these girls constructed themselves individually as women, mixed race, and migrants in a coercive environment? How did these girls feel about the demands for assimilation they were faced in? Thanks to accounts by those affected, it is possible to examine private and individual experiences. This is about evaluating the impact of the traumas of uprooting, as well as postcolonial biopolitics on the subjective personal development of Eurasian girls, above and beyond the collective experience of assimilation. I seek new contributions from intersectional studies, gender studies, and postcolonial studies must be mobilized to study the personal experiences of these young migrants. In the interviews, Eurasian women, now between the age of 56 and 83, all express the desire to understand what had happened to them. In mobilizing interviews, photographs, letters, archives of both organization and social medias, the ambition was to historically reconstruct the unique private experiences, prioritizing the process of subjectivation, meaning the awareness by the subject of her own individuality. This is how an account emerged which seeks to define three major relationships that structures the personal development of the young Eurasians. First, the relationship to the surroundings and the educational structures. Second, the relationship with other people at different age of their childhood and youth. And finally, the relationships they had with their own identity that were often very complex because they were always evolving. Young migrant girls became adolescents and then young women. They saw their body transform, they affirmed their femininity on their relationship with their country of birth change. But first, it is essential to provide some context. During the Indochina Wars, the presence of a large French expeditionary force considerably increased the number of mixed-race children, Eurasian and African children. Founded in 1945, the FOEFI organized a forced migration of mixed-race children. This operating was based on the 1928 decree stipulating that, quote, any individual born in Indochina to parents of who one is presumed to be of the French race shall be able to obtain recognition of French status, unquote. Therefore, taken charge of by the French state and repatriated. Mothers, rejected by their families and community, accept to entrust their children to the FOEFI for own girl. The gendered natures of this singular transnational migration, which involved around 5,000 Eurasian children, is clear. The FOEFI entrusts the education of the girls to religious establishments, even if, theoretically, quote, the girls benefit from the same benevolent arrangements as the boys, unquote. In fact, the boys were hosted in regular institutions directly administered by the FOEFI with domestic staff, while the girls did all the housekeeping themselves under the guidance of nuns. The transfers of Eurasian children to France by the FOEFI lasted from 1947 to the early 1970s. 500 girls left Vietnam and moved into a former abbey in Saint-Lambert-en-Bugey near Lyon. The Eurasian who had spent several years of their childhood and adolescence in Saint-Lambert all considered the abbey like a protective cocoon. On the other hand, the impression of imprisonment was also very strong. All of them insisted upon their lives as reclused in a prison, as well as on the total absence of any contact with the outside world. No newspapers, no TV, no radio, except for the Pope's Easter blessing, but nothing on the Vietnam War. Any broken rule was sanctioned by punishment, starting with no desert to the whip. Difficult girls were sent to the institution run by Sisters of Good Shepherd, experts in the reform for bad girls. The time spent at the abbey was important for the individuation process. The Eurasians, who were older when they arrived, lived there for 2 or 3 years. The younger ones stayed for 10 or 12 years. The common point of all the individual experiences of the youngest girls was the lack of understanding on what they were going through. But what I am doing here, what I am waiting for, and they never received answers to these questions. As they grew up, the FOEFI wards were enrolled in secondary schools, home economics or professional training courses, and more seldom in high schools. For this operated, marriage seemed to be a way to escape worship, which corresponded to the wishes of the nuns and the FOEFI. Quote, marriage is the ultimate illustration of integration into the French nation, unquote. Whether they kept good memories or a less idyllic vision of the time at Saint-Rambert, since one cannot leave the abbey unaffected. Many Eurasians remained attached to the abbey, calling it our home, my home. Among the most critical exports, some never wanted to go back because they had too many always traumatic, bad memories. Others made a clear distinction between the home that would always be theirs and the education model received that they reject. In Saint-Rambert, the borders only dealt with 6 or 7 nuns. The FOEFI's annual activity reports repeated that the world are happy, like the abbey, like the mothers, and joyously accept the moral and material order that ensures them a peaceful atmosphere in which they blossom, unquote. This idyllic presentation of the relationship between the motherly and attentive nuns and the docile and studious Eurasian is not confirmed by the account of the ex-boarders. They considered that the sisters did not see motherly, brotherly, or affectionate expressions in their attitude. The nuns were not empathetic to the girls reporting migration and war-related traumas. Most of them said they had felt a lack of respect because they bastarded. Religious education, as it was transmitted in Saint-Rambert, could not fill this void. Immigrants had to forget the Taoist or Buddhist teachings they had received. What was taught was not a religion of love, but a religion of guilt, with no way of escape. Quote, God knows everything, is everything, sees everything, even in the dark, unquote. Quote, we were always guilty before God, unquote. So the Eurasians felt they shaped themselves as individuals together among themselves, alongside the sisters, not with them, even against them, and contrary to the education they had received. As for male role models, they were rare. For the vast majority, the father figures was completely absent. The only men they knew were the chaplain and the handyman of the abbey. Several told the story of how, on the boat journey to France, they transferred their affections onto French soldiers on their way home, imagining that these men were their fathers. One of them would keep a barret given to her by a man she had chosen as dad. Understanding and learning about femininity by Eurasian migrant girls was impacted by the post-colonial context and the constrained surroundings. Even if their bodies were developing and their femininity was asserting itself, the girls received no education of this kind. Nudity had been natural in Indochina, but it became a sin in the religious institution as everything else concerning the body. All the women I interviewed talk about their first period, the intimate experience of menstruation and their incomprehension. The taboo was complete, even more with the men. They did not give what was needed. What was needed. And the girls had to manage with unsuitable clothes. It was the older girls who showed what had to be done instead of what it was about. Without sex education, even minimal information was not given on steps towards what womanhood were not guided. During the childhood of the repatriated girls, their relationships with their country of origin were linked to the memories that they kept or not. Today, some of them still express war-related traumas, recalling fears, bombings, fires, and burns, thirst, and hunger. One of the women had lived for 4 years in the Viet Minh prison camp where her parents had died. Others had no memory at all. The distance separating France from Vietnam was experienced in different ways. The first ones to arrive after a 30-day boat journey were aware of being far away their country. They knew they would not go back to Vietnam and that their former life was over. Those who arrived by plane did not have the same understanding of geographic distance. Once they had arrived at their destinations, some expected to return to Vietnam, lacking the notion of time and space, remaining sad and desperate. The language questions was important also. This is what the FOEFI had in mind in strictly forbidding their wards to speak any language other than French. But sisters could not stop the girls from using Vietnamese words when they wanted to show their displeasure or talk secretly between themselves. Relationships with the family back home were limited to minimal correspondence with family back home. 2 letters a year at Christmas and at Easter. All of them wrote more or less the same thing. I am doing well. I am working hard at school. The few letters received were just simple and could not contribute to maintaining a real link. Besides, these letters were opened by the sisters. Finally, relationship with mother were complex. The sacrificial position of mother was not made clear to the girls who wondered why they had been abandoned. By not giving them the answers, the nuns maintained a destabilizing context. It was only much later that the girls understood the sacrifice of their mothers, sometimes when they themselves had children. It is often at this moment that they express themselves, notably through poetry, confidential or published, like this text by Monique Baldry. To conclude, the personal development of the young Eurasian girls repatriated to France in the post-colonial context work in 3 ways. They had to build their identity as migrants, as women, and as people of mixed race. The upbringing they received, the upbringing they received, minimized the operating by favoring the term repatriation and erased their origins via assimilation. But women defined themselves as subject by canceling many things, but also by mobilizing their powers of resilience to become women adapted to French society. They all sing they all think that the education they received did not prepare them for real life. Leaving the abbey was a great adventure. They went suit hollow. They did not know how to buy a bus ticket, how to set an alarm clock, know how society worked in general. The specificity of the agency in young Eurasian girls stems from the conjunction of several structuring elements in the construction, including the mixed race origin. Nonetheless, they succeeded in maintaining a race memories in which they recognize themselves. The questions of researching one's origins and of a potential return to the native country came into play well after the Eurasians started working. Quote, "We did not have the time. We had to work, start a family, have children," unquote. Many only began to take more interest in their origin after their retirements, sometimes when their first grandchild was born, when they saw a documentary of Vietnam or at the request of an historian. As for the struggle of talking to the children about their stories, this woman explained it as an attempt to understand a complicated family situation in a very specific context. As one of my interviews said, quote, "I did not know the answers to my questions. So how could I answer my children's questions?" Thank you for your attention and see you soon for questions. Bye.